The Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire, Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, we examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I will make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're someone who can't remember what you ate for dinner last night, but can immediately recall baseball statistics that you memorized when you were 12 years old, then this is the podcast for you. Let me once again address the elephant in the room. I've never played professional baseball. I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney, and believe me when I tell you that it is way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to look up antiquated Latin terms in a legal dictionary. The subject of our second episode is Detroit Tigers fan favorite Lou Whitaker. Now, if you've ever waded into the choppy waters of the Hall of Fame debate, then you'll know this is one of the most discussed players and one who garners very strong opinions and emotions, both for and against enshrinement. He's someone who traditional statistics and criteria at the time of his retirement maybe were a bit unkind to his Hall of Fame chances, but he's also someone whose case has grown stronger, both due in part to the rise of advanced statistics or sabermetrics, as well as the long pull of nostalgia. Speaking of nostalgia, as you know, I make the case in each episode in three parts. The first is statistics, the second is hardware, and third is what I call the fame factor. That's where a little bit of nostalgia plays into it. And just a brief breakdown, statistics, I look at one eye in the past and one in the future. We're going to look at traditional statistics, kind of what they call counting statistics, as well as some of the advanced sabermetrics. In terms of hardware, we look at whether this player was voted as an all-star, whether they won MVP or Cy Young Awards if they're a pitcher, Golden Gloves, Silver Sluggers. We also look at their postseason accolades, see if they won any awards, how they did in the postseason. And then third, the fame factor. This is where my podcast differs a little bit from some of the more statistical-based analysis you might find on the subject. I like to look at the fame factor. For me, it's fun. I always like to ask, think of the person you know that doesn't really know anything about baseball or doesn't follow baseball, and ask yourself, do they know who this person is? And if so, maybe it doesn't necessarily mean they're the best player, it just means they have somewhat of a fame factor. They're known. They're someone that grows the game of baseball because they're known outside of the circle of just baseball nerds like myself. I know these factors can be arbitrary. To me, they're important. They add a little bit of poetry and mysticism to the Hall of Fame discussion. So, as you know from my last episode on Dale Murphy, we're going to go into the mystic here a little bit, people. So, without further ado, let's make the case for Lou Whitaker. Lou Whitaker spent 19 years playing Major League Baseball, all of them with the Detroit Tigers. He retired with a career batting average of a very respectable .276. He had 2,369 hits and a very impressive 1,386 runs. He also had 420 doubles, 65 triples, 244 home runs, 1,084 RBIs. Career on-base percentage of .363, slugging percentage of .426, OPS is .789. Now, these are very respectable numbers, but by some of the traditional counting statistics, they don't stack up to other Hall of Famers. He didn't get 3,000 hits, had just under 2,400. Again, very impressive, great career, but if you're going to go into the Hall of Fame based on the amount of career hits alone, it's going to fall short. Or based on batting average alone, .276, again, very respectable career batting average, but you have individuals with career batting averages well in excess of 300 who aren't in the Hall of Fame. So, it's going to be tough. Lou Whitaker's case for the Hall of Fame statistically is going to come not just on his counting stats, but also his defensive stats and his sabermetric stats. So I want to sort of dive into his actually defensive stats first. Among second basemen, he's fourth all-time for games played at second base. Now, the first three are all Hall of Famers. Eddie Collins, if you remember from 8 Men Out, one of the few White Sox players not suspended. Joe Morgan and Roberto Alomar. These are three of the greatest second basemen of all time. And Lou's right up there, number 4. And again, I said in my last podcast, Participation alone isn't enough to get you in the Hall of Fame, but that just shows he's, one of the top 5 at the position all time. That counts for something. It's impressive, but again, mere participation alone isn't enough to get you in the Hall of Fame. There's a lot of players who played a lot of games who are not Hall of Famers. So let's look at some of the stats that he accrued defensively while playing second base. And this is probably his biggest strength in terms of a defensive statistic. He's 4th all-time for double plays turned amongst second basemen. Interestingly, number 1 is Bill Mazeroski. A lot of people thought that Bill Mazeroski sort of snuck in the Hall of Fame on the strength of his home run. He remember hit the famous home run to win the World Series. But people tend to forget he was also a 10-time All-Star, 8-time Gold Glove, great defensive second baseman. So anyway, I don't want to get off on Bill Mazeroski, but I thought it was interesting because he was someone kind of like Lou, who was, on the fence, and there's some strong feelings both ways. Number 2 all-time for double plays turned at second base is Hall of Famer Nellie Fox. Number 3, Willie Randolph. I want you to remember that name. We're going to talk about him a little. He's a good comparison player. He's contemporary with Lou, also not in the Hall of Fame. All-time among second basemen, Lou Whitaker's 11th all-time for putouts. Now, remember Willie Randolph? He's number 9. Every other player in the top 11, excluding Randolph and Lou, are in the Hall of Fame. Lou Whitaker is 6th all-time amongst second basemen for assists. Now, Willie Randolph is 10. Another guy named Frank White is 12. Lou and Willie are the only 2 players in the top 10 not in the Hall of Fame. Now, I mentioned Frank White because he's another contemporary, another good comparison player. I want to look at some of the advanced statistics here defensively amongst second basemen. Total zone runs, Lou Whitaker's number 9. Interestingly, Frank White is number 2, and Willie Randolph is number 3. So I bring that up. This is just a kind of a obscure statistic here, but just goes to show you that, was he the best defensive second baseman of his era? Maybe. He's got 2 contemporaries here. You're going to see Frank and Willie pop up a lot. In this case, Frank and Willie are ranked highly, ahead of him. So in Lou's defense, there's also a lot of non-Hall of Famers in this top 10, including Mark Lemke, Atlanta Braves legend, at number 10. I love Mark Lemke. I don't get off on Mark Lemke, but sorry, Mark, I don't think you would make the Hall of Fame, but it's still a fan favorite. So maybe total zone runs is a bad advanced statistic to base this off. Another one is range factor. This is another advanced statistic. Lou's number 21, kind of up there, right behind, you guessed it, Willie Randolph at number 20. His contemporary Frank White is number 12. Again, though, this is a kind of obscure statistic. Lots of non-Hall of Famers in the top of this category, including, believe it or not, Glenn Hubbard at number 1. Another Braves legend, but not a Hall of Famer. Fielding percentage. Last time on my Dale Murphy podcast, we talked about fielding percentage. I get made fun of sometimes for bringing up fielding percentage, but, it's a statistic. We're going through all the statistics. This is where it gets a little interesting. Lou is nowhere near the top of career leaders for fielding percentage. He's actually tied for 62nd all-time with 4 other players. But in Lou's defense, one of those 4 players is Hall of Famer Craig Biggio. Right, so there's hope. In fact, in number 61 in that list is Roberto Alomar, who's in the Hall of Fame, contemporary in terms of playing the same time with Lou Whitaker. And I don't think anyone's going to say Roberto Alomar is not a Hall of Famer in terms of his statistics. And Nellie Fox, another Hall of Famer, is number 68. So there you go. Maybe fielding percentage doesn't mean anything. So in Lou's defense, Ozzie Smith, guy who's considered generally one of the best fielding shortstops in history. He's 26th all-time for fielding percentage for a shortstop. So maybe fielding percentage means nothing. Maybe it does. I don't know. So what does all of this mean? By traditional and advanced fielding statistics, Lou's a very good fielding second baseman, but he's not at the top of any of the leaderboards that we previously discussed. In fact, in some instances, he ranks behind 2 other second basemen that played during the same era, Willie Randolph and Frank White. I mention these 2 as comparison players as part of the debate over whether Lou was the preeminent defensive second baseman of his era. Some of his stats, as we discussed, indicated he had several peers in Willie and Frank who were just as good, if not arguably better, in some statistical categories. Now, bear in mind, these are some niche advanced statistical categories. Nevertheless, in those categories, Willie and Frank in some instances were ranked higher than him. So in that respect, Willie and Frank make for two very interesting comparison players because while they were both very good players, no offense, I'll save you the suspense and say that I won't be doing a podcast about either of them because, with all due respect, I don't think they're Hall of Famers. And feel free to review their statistics and let me know if you disagree with me. Find me on Twitter, shoot me an email. But the one statistic I did discuss that really does stand in Lou's favor is that he's fourth all-time for double plays turned for second baseman. Now, I want to differentiate that with another statistic I'm gonna mention right now, which I think is Lou's one of two of Lou's best cases for the Hall of Fame. Now, Lou is fourth all time for double plays turned amongst second basemen. Now, speaking of double plays turned, I think perhaps his strongest case for the Hall is that Lou Whitaker at second base and his teammate Alan Trammell at shortstop are the longest running double play combination in baseball history. I'll say that again because it's sort of a catchphrase you hear when people describe Lou Whitaker. Him and Alan Trammell are the longest running double play combination in baseball history. Together, the two of them played 1,918 games together over 19 years, turning 1,527 double plays together during that time period, a major league record. Wow. I have to say, if there is one statistic or one thing you're going to point out about Lou that you're going to put on his plaque and say this is his sort of claim to fame, I think it's the double play combination with him and Alan Trammell. And remember, too, Alan Trammell is already in the Hall of Fame based on the strength of a lot of the statistics and the fame categories that we're discussing here for Lou Whitaker. So that's a very compelling case. Over 19 years, as I mentioned, Trammell and Lou turned 1,527 double plays together. So their histories are intertwined. They played in the minors together. They actually made their major league debut together on the same day, September 10th, 1977, at Fenway Park against the Boston Red Sox. So when we get to the fame factor, I'm going to talk a little bit about Lou and Alan. And after I go through Lou's statistics, I'm going to compare Lou's statistics with Alan. I think that's going to make a strong case for Lou. Now, we mentioned earlier some of Lou's career offensive statistics, or what we call his counting statistics. And by traditional sort of counting statistics measures, they fall somewhat short of the traditional Hall of Fame criteria. He's never led the league in a single offensive category. The only exception, he tied for the lead league in games played in 1981 with 109. That was a strike-shortened season, and several other players played 109 games, so technically, I don't know if you want to consider that an offensive category, games played. But other than that, never once led the league in any offensive category, although he had some very good years. In fact, his best year offensively was 1983. He finished 8th in the MVP voting. He had 94 runs, 206 hits, 40 doubles, 6 triples, 12 home runs, 72 RBIs, 17 stolen bases, and a slash line of 320, 380, and 457 for an 837 OPS. So it was a very good year. That was actually the only year that he got any MVP votes. So if you're of the frame of mind that, for hardware purposes, you need somebody that's won multiple MVPs or received MVP votes in multiple seasons, only one season. But if you look at his his career statistics amongst second basemen, according to StatMuse, another website we mentioned last time, amongst second basemen, he ranks number 9 in hits, number 7 in runs, 11th in RBI, and number 10 in home runs. Again, very respectable, but offensively, he doesn't really stand out. Now, earlier I mentioned his double play turning combination with Alan Trammell as one of two statistics which are really his claim to fame for the Hall of Fame. The second statistic is going to be his career wins above replacement, or WAR number. Now, we talked about WAR on my last episode about Dale Murphy, wins above replacement. Now, it's a really good statistic in theory. The idea behind WAR is that it's supposed to be the amount of wins a team gets from a player. I mean, that's a super condensed, reductive description of what it is. But it's supposed to encompass all of the player's attributes, offensive, defensive, and take into account the complete totality of a player. I'm not going to get into all the details. There's a lot of strong opinions for or against, but kind of like I said with fielding percentage, it's a statistic. It's out there. A lot of people put a lot of stock into it. So I'm addressing it here and in all my episodes, along with some of the other traditional counting statistics. And in Lou's case, his career WAR, when combined with his double play combination statistics with Alan Trammell, and then again his very respectable career offensive and defensive stats, I think are the two things that really push him over the edge are the career WAR and the double play combination. Now, last episode I mentioned that 50 to 70 is sort of the sweet spot. If you've got a WAR between 50 or 70, then you're looking at, Hall of Fame consideration. 75 or higher, there's a lot of people out there that say, hey, that's automatic, Hall of Fame. Lou Whitaker's career WAR is 75.1. So he's way up there in terms of career WAR. He's number 51 all-time, actually tied with Johnny Bench. And interestingly enough, of the 50 players with a higher career WAR than Lou, every single one of them except for one is either in the Hall of Fame, will be, there's Pujols and Adrian Beltre, or is not in due to, what I'll call other issues. Bonds, A-Rod, Rose, get into all that later. The only other player in that 50 not in the Hall of Fame is a guy named Bill Dahlen. Hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Who has a 75.3 WAR. Now, we may do an episode on this guy. He played between 1891 and 1911. He's someone whose career has been re-examined in modern times thanks to advanced statistics, and who the Society for American Baseball Research, or SABR, has called, quote, the overlooked 19th century baseball legend for 2012. Put that in your resume. So it's fair to say, I think it'll take some time, but this guy, Bill Dahlen, will get in. Why am I getting off on Bill Dahlen? Just to reinforce the argument that with some off-the-field issue exceptions, and this guy, Bill Dahlen, who's overlooked and will probably get in, basically every single other Hall of Famer with a WAR higher than Lou in that 50 are not just Hall of Famers, but, first ballot Hall of Famers, Mount Rushmore type players. So this puts Lou in a pretty good footing in terms of his case for the Hall of Fame. So statistically, the two things that to me are really the strongest case Lou has for the Hall of Fame are his career WAR, 75.1, and the double play combination, the all-time double play combination, him and Alan Trammell. Now, with regard to Alan Trammell, the other thing I want to bring up is that Alan Trammell, who played shortstop while Lou was at second, is already in the Hall of Fame. So I'm going to, if you'll bear with me a little bit, I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment here. If you assume that, okay, Alan is in the Hall of Fame, he's another middle infielder, 19 years, I believe 19 years with the Tigers, almost identical careers in terms of where they played, but he's in the Hall of Fame. So if you compare Lou and Alan's stats straight up, surprisingly, Lou has better stats. I'm going to compare them a little bit here. In terms of, without getting into the numbers, Lou, if you compare the two, leads Alan in games played, plate appearances, at-bats, runs, hits, doubles, triples, home runs, RBIs, walks, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, and total bases. Wow. If you're comparing the two head-to-head in terms of counting stats, if Allen's in, then Lou's got to be in. All right, let's talk about hardware. Let's talk about awards. Lou Whitaker won the 1978 American League Rookie of the Year award. Interestingly enough, beating out two Hall of Famers in the process. One, Paul Molitor, finished number 2 that year, who's in the Hall of Fame, over 3,000 hits, another second baseman, and contemporary with Lou Whitaker. And interestingly enough, beating out his teammate Alan Trammell, who finished 4th that year. He was a 5-time All-Star, 3-time Golden Glove Award winner, 4-time Silver Slugger. Only got MVP votes in one season, though, as you mentioned, 1983, finished 8th. Now, I want to stop right there, look at hardware, because I know that hardware can be subjective. I say this every time. It's important and it's not. I think it's interesting that Lou Whitaker, whose Hall of Fame case is built largely on his defense, only won 3 Golden Gloves. just something to consider. I think also more interesting is the fact that he won 4 Silver Sluggers. So that shows his range as a player. He was strong defensively and as well as offensively. He was a 1984 World Series champion with the Tigers. We'll talk about this a little bit later. That's really important to Lou's legacy, I think. He only batted 143 in the ALCS that year, but he had a very strong performance in the World Series. He hit 278 with 5 hits and 6 runs. We'll talk about this in the fame factor, but that's another one of these literally claim to fame for Lou Whitaker. He's a huge part of the 1984 World Series champion Tigers team. And then in the 1987 ALCS, he hit a home run, but in 5 games and 17 at-bats, he only had 3 hits, batted 176. So basically, in 3 playoff series, in the ALCS in 87 and 84, didn't really have a strong showing, but doesn't really matter because when it counted in 1984 in the World Series, he came out swinging, hit 278, 5 hits, 6 runs, huge part of that 1984 World Series championship team. And speaking of which, that's a good segue to get into number 3, the fame factor. I like to talk about this, as you know. A lot of people just focus on statistics. Folks, it's not the Hall of Stats, it's the Hall of Fame. Let's talk about the fame factor of Lou Whitaker. I've mentioned it before. Lou Whitaker was known as a double play combination with Alan Trammell. I'll say it again, 1,918 games over 19 Major League seasons. These two guys, Lou and Alan, turned more double plays than anyone at second base and shortstop, the longest running double play combination in Major League Baseball history. That's huge. To me, I think that's important. Look, if you know baseball, everyone loves home runs. Double plays are another essential but maybe overlooked part of the game, almost like the antithesis of the home run. It's a total buzzkill if your team is on offense, but it's exhilarating if your team is on defense. If it's the bottom of the 9th and you've got a 1-run lead and your team is pitching, you want to preserve that lead and you've got some great batter up, and all of a sudden they turn a double play. Oh, wow, that changes the game. So a double play is a big deal. I know they're not as exciting necessarily as a home run, but that's a big deal. Now, does that get him in the Hall of Fame just on the reputation of this long-running double play combination alone? Well, as you know, I'm an attorney. We like to talk about precedent. Believe it or not, there is precedent for this. If you're a baseball fan, you might know the names Tinker, Evers, and Chance. These were second baseman, shortstop, first baseman. They were a big double play combination that helped the Cubs win 4 pennants between 1906 and 1910. All 3 of these guys are in the Hall of Fame, largely on the strength of this reputation. There was actually a poem written about them called Baseball's Sad Lexicon. It was written in 1910 by Franklin Pierce Adams. I'll briefly read it just because it's short, it's very poetic. It goes a little something like this. These are the saddest of possible words. Tinker to Evers to Chance. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds. Tinker and Evers and Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our gonfalon bubble, making a giant hit into a double, words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Now, if you look at the career statistics of this trio of bear cubs, Tinker, Evers, and Chance, I'm not trying to knock on, the memories of baseball long past, but honestly, if you look at their career statistics, if they played today and retired, they're not getting in the Hall of Fame. Now, they had very good and respectable careers, but they largely got into the Hall of Fame based on the reputation of being this great double play turning combination that helped win 4 pennants. Well, if you're going to let these 3 other guys go in based on their double play combination turning, why not let Lou Whitaker in when he's one half of the longest running double play combination in history? Trammell's already in the other half, and as we mentioned, when you look at the career counting statistics, in almost every category, Lou has better statistics offensively than Trammell. So there's a case for Lou Whitaker. One of the last things I want to talk about here in terms of the fame factor, I always say, does somebody know who they are? The lunchbox factor, all this sort of, going into the mystic here. Look, Lou Whitaker, if you don't know this, he's a fan favorite in Detroit. I mentioned it before. He helped them deliver their 1984 World Series title. If you know anything about Detroit sports, look, my wife's from Detroit. I'm not trying to pick on anybody here, but let's just call it what it is. If you know anything about Detroit's sports history, it's not a pleasant one. They aren't known for winning a lot of championships. Look, I love the Lions in the NFL. They're a tough team to cheer for. And with all due respect to the Tigers, they've had some rough years. They haven't won a World Series since 1984. But you know what? This 1984 team was big. I know the team itself is not getting inducted, but I want to talk a little bit about the team because I want you to understand how important this team was to baseball history and how good they were because Lou is such an important part of them. There's a book out there called Bless You Boys. It's by Sparky Anderson. He was the manager of the 1984 Detroit Tigers, and it's essentially his diary of the season. He mentions in there a statistic that I thought was fascinating, and I looked it up online, and it checks out that the Detroit Tigers in 1984, they started out the season in first place on the first day, and they ended the season in first place, winning the World Series. Every day of the season, they were in first place. Only 2 other teams in baseball history have ever done that. The 1923 Giants and the 1927 Yankees. If you know anything about baseball history, 1927 Yankees is just a mythical team. Murderers Row, generally considered the greatest team ever. I mean, if you want to sit down and have a podcast or what's the greatest team ever, I mean, I don't know if it's ultimately going to win the bracket, the Tournament of Champions, but it's definitely in the conversation. So that just goes to show you this 84 Tigers team was special. Why am I mentioning all this? Just in terms of the fame factor, I mentioned last time the Hall of Fame mission is to preserve baseball history. In fact, the mission statement of the Hall of Fame is to preserve the sport's history, honor excellence within the game, and make a connection between the generations of people who enjoy baseball. So I think that this favors Lou Whitaker because he's one half of a famous double play combination who, not only played 19 years, but was a huge part of a really famous 1984 World Series champion team. I mean, one of the teams, if you were going to have a conversation, greatest teams ever, I mean, it may not be the winner, but it's up there. In terms of the fame factor that year, another thing I learned from Sparky Anderson's book, Bless You Boys, which I looked on the internet, apparently it's true, the wave was invented that year. Apparently some folks from Ann Arbor, I think some college students had done it a game or two and then brought it to the Tigers game. So not only were they in first place the whole season, but apparently the wave was invented. Depending on your opinions of the wave, you may now hate the 84 Tigers or love them. But regardless, I mean, if you've ever been to a baseball game, love it or hate it, the wave is a thing. It's there. And it all started with the 84 Tigers and their winning season. And Lou Whitaker was a huge part of that. Even before the 84 season, look, him and Trammell were... they were big stars. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that they appeared on a 1983 episode of Magnum P.I. together. I mean, they were famous. They were well known. So what does all this mean? Let's combine it all. In terms of offense, as we've shown, he's got very respectable career statistics offensively, but nothing in terms of counting stats that really places him in the Hall of Fame. So if you're someone who looks at counting stats alone, he doesn't make it. In fact, I'll say I've gone on record before saying Lou Whitaker is not a Hall of Famer. And when I said that, I was looking at his counting stats alone. But I've taken a bit of a deep dive, and I gotta say, I've changed my opinion. While he doesn't really meet the criteria in terms of his counting stats are impressive enough, and in some cases better than other people that are in the Hall of Fame. But taken in the totality with his defensive stats, which again, he doesn't hold any major records except for the double play combination with Trammell. When you look at the totality of his offense, his defensive playing, the double play combination number, and his career WAR of 75, which puts him, again, number 51, and everyone in the 50 is, upper tier caliber. I think that my opinion has changed on Lou Whitaker, and I think he's a Hall of Famer. I hope I've made the case for Lou, and if you like this podcast and you want to tell me why you think this changed your mind, let me know at Twitter at @thecase4, that's capital T, capital C, capital F, or shoot me an email at thecase4podcast@gmail.com. Likewise, if you think I'm crazy, if you don't agree with me at all, let me know. I'd like to hear it. I'm not perfect, but I like to look at this stuff. And look, I know I put a little bit more on the fame factor than the numbers, but it's the Hall of Fame. It's not the Hall of Stats. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode where we're going to discuss Colorado Rockies great Todd Helton. In the meantime, remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and go watch a baseball game.